Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka Saxena, your host for this episode and a research analyst with Takshashila's Indo-Pacific Studies program. And today I have the opportunity to quiz and pick the brains of Satya Sahu, my colleague from the High-Tech Geopolitics program. And today I thought we could delve a little bit into this economic and defense sector that's been a lot in the discussion lately, amidst kind of all the policy shift towards Atmanirbharta and indigenous defense production in India, right? And this is the sector of strategic electronics. Of course, there are both civilian, commercial, and defense components to this, which is something we can delve into through the course of the episode. But of course, the requirements, the challenges of production, the firms and enterprises and government entities involved, in some places, of course, overlap when it comes to both civilian and defense-related strategic electronics. And Satya, I know for a fact that most recently you were there with me. We attended the 14th Strategic Electronics Summit. It took place in Bangalore. And, of course, a lot of equipment and defense tech was on display. There were a lot of entrepreneurs that attended the session in addition to government officials, and different quarters representing different entities and agencies had opinions on what India's indigenization journey should look like when it comes to strategic electronics. What maybe are the challenges we face with production, and how effective maybe our trade barriers have been against countries like China, which are some of the world's biggest manufacturers of stuff like strategic electronics, right? So these were, of course, the questions raised, and different agencies had different takes on it. But Satya, let me come to you with my first question, which is, quickly for our listeners, can you give a lay of the land of what it means for maybe a product to be a strategic electronic? And again, what were maybe your takeaways from the views presented by different parties at the Strategic Electronics Summit? Over to you.
Hi, thanks, Anushka. Let's going back to the basics. Any electronics can really be strategic if you think about it, depending on what the government really wants. For instance, now we have a lot of industrial policy instruments that are focused on building display sub-assemblies in India. Your run-of-the-mill LCD panels, etc. Why exactly is that clubbed alongside semiconductor devices, etc., which are essentially needed for a lot of our critical infrastructure? No one knows, but apparently it's a strategic priority. But going back to the basics, right? Any advanced electronic systems and components, when I say advanced, I don't necessarily mean at the cutting edge of things, but things that are very specifically made for defense, aerospace, and other quote-unquote strategic applications, right, which are critical to national security. So any electronic systems and components that are primarily used for these are strategic electronics. The definition has expanded over time, since now a lot of commercial off-the-shelf devices, even consumer electronics and systems and components are used in defense as well, defense applications. But colloquially and conventionally, we think about it in terms of, let's say, radar systems, electronic warfare equipment, communication systems, electronic optics, for instance, even things like, let's say, night vision goggles or thermal scopes on soldiers' rifles, that can have components that can be classified as strategic electronics. Sorry, I completely missed the second part, which was the insights I got from the Strategic Electronics Summit.
Yeah. And the kind of positions and stances of maybe the government versus the private sector on the idea of trade barriers, indigenization, and production of strategic electronics.
Right. You may have to remind me that again. I'm not good at this. But anyway, so first things first. The summit had it is a very unique experience. First of all, I don't think I've seen a platform like this elsewhere in India. It had a good mix of officers from the armed forces, senior officers. Then it had obviously the private sector industry, as well as quite a few public sector PSUs, for instance. tour there with the products, the services. There was an expo as well, alongside the conference and panel discussions. First thing that stood out to me was that this sector has seen quite a bit of growth over the last few years, actually. Something that did not happen for a long time. And recently, I think the print had come out with a article which talks about exactly how much India has been exporting in defense, by the way. Like, the conventional wisdom says that India is one of the world's largest defense exporter, right? I think maybe it is the largest as well. So, but over, I think since 2020, we have been exporting a lot of defense equipment as well. I think in this quarter, if I am not wrong, something around 6,900 something crores in the April to June quarter, right, in 2024. That's a lot compared to where we were in, say, 2020.
The largest importer, right?
Yeah, but it's becoming very quickly becoming one of the world's, I would say, not dominant, but rising and fast accelerating defense exporters as well.
Right.
Right. And I think the print reported that out of the things that India was exporting, the usual things like ammunition, small arms, bulletproof jackets, helmets. But alongside those, there were things like electronic items that help the going torpedoes, the simulators, drones, and fast attack vessels. All of this requires quite a few advanced electronics components, right? And it's unclear right now if those are being made indigenously or if they're being procured from other countries like Taiwan, China, the EU, for instance, or other places in East Asia, and then being assembled here, right? So that's a good question. But the point is, this sector has grown by leaps and bounds in the last few years, right? So that was something that struck me immediately when we were there. And the two common arguments that we heard there by both industry as well as government and armed forces is that the Indian electronic sector's production capabilities need to be bolstered, right? So, which is why I'm talking about whether or not we're assembling or are we manufacturing is a question that needs to be answered, or we need more data on it, because the government's demand for advanced strategic electronics is rising, especially because we are shutting down avenues of procurement from other countries, particularly China, which is, and we'll talk about this later, I guess, which has a huge dominant position in the value chain for this electronics. The second thing that arose is, for some reason, both industry and government echoed the idea that this kind of demand should be met by the private sector in India at much lower costs compared to those that are being charged by foreign vendors. Now, to long-time listeners of the podcast, they would realize that this is a difficult endeavor to embark on because of the nature of the economics of the electronics global value chains, right? It's heavily fragmented, and the reason why this exists is to take advantage of the cost differentials and comparative advantages of multiple countries. And so, if you don't have a foothold in that value chain, the initial startup costs are going to be massive. And therefore, I don't know how this idea about meeting this demand on much lower costs came about, but it's there. Is there? What was the third question? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, this was largely it, right? And I'm really fascinated to hear about India's kind of trajectory as maybe the largest or one of the largest growth partners when it comes to exporting of electronics. And I know for a fact that the Niti Aayog in the month of July itself, shortly after the 14th Strategic Electronics Summit, came out with a report called Electronics Powering India's Participation in Global Value Chains, which kind of tried to make the case that our ambitious target towards integrating with the global value chains should be an export of electronics to the tune of about $350 billion. And I think in the 2023-24 financial year, we stood somewhere around 101 billion. So clearly we have a long way to go, but it's good to have the target. But like you said, there are challenges because China obviously is a dominant partner in all of this. And, for example, if you think of solar photovoltaic cells as a strategic electronic, right? We know for a fact that because of a bunch of factors, right? State subsidies, continued investment in coal-based manufacturing, despite calls for maybe a shift to renewable energy, because of the support provided to state-owned enterprises, China has at least occupied 70 to 80% of the market when it comes to each of the many pillars of producing solar photovoltaic cells. And naturally, when you invest so much and reap the kind of benefits that you do, as China has with a strategic electronic like solar photovoltaic cells, you also gain a competitive edge in affiliated fields or fields where these electronics are used, like electric vehicles, for example, right? Which or other renewable energy related infrastructure, right? Which is something again that's been a dominant theme of discussion today. But I think in all of my questions, I should have taken a step back and talked about these trade barriers that I've referred to maybe twice or thrice in the starting of this episode, and what India's tryst with these restrictions has been. And you alluded to this as well, that we have this kind of restrictive policy, and I see two strands of policy emerging. One is, of course, that you identify a sector as critical to economic growth or national security, and you attach maybe a production linked or design linked incentive to it, maybe as in the case of semiconductors, or you restrict imports from a foreign country and let domestic firms take on the course to produce this over the years. In your perspective, maybe what have been the opportunities and challenges from the Indian policy kind of approach towards producing these at home, and if maybe you could also delve into some of these restrictions that we've both referred to, and are they ailments, are they boosters, what do the trends look like to you?
That's a good question. Actually, it's a mixed bag. Let me first go over the, how do I say it, the sentiment that I saw being echoed in the strategic learning summit itself by the private sector players who were there, showcasing their products there. And when I asked them, I interviewed them about the kind of hurdles they've been facing in terms of being able to prototype their equipment or being able to purchase, the sub assemblies, the boards, the chips that are essential for making the products in the first place, right? You can't design a product without being able to import a lot of these things. Now, there are two things. The government, the Ministry of Defense, I think, has instituted a bunch of, let's say, QVL lists, right? Qualified vendor lists, which have I think, a very strict rule against being procuring from China. Well, also most components, I would say, just like in the 2023 August military drone component ban, right? So we banned those components from being procured from China. So what ended up happening is that a very important avenue for these private sector players to be able to prototype the products, be able to source the chips and the assemblies that are required to make the, let's say, a drone, right? So to make a drone for this and to have sensors that go onto it, a very important avenue was for them to be able to order from China. And one of them, I think, told me that the cost of being having to procure that from another player in India is first, like, I think 20 times higher, simply because China has the advantage in terms of economies of scale, right? The factories, the foundries or the assembly plants cater to both domestic electronics demand as well as export electronics. So for them to be able to prototype a particular thing is far cheaper than for an equivalent kind of entity in India who has to do things from scratch, has to figure out how to get the materials, the processes, they have to get it right. And finally, quality control, and this, which is brings me to my second point. The quality control in made by Indian firms for some reason is not great, and that directly impinges on the private sector players to be able to make good products, right? So it's difficult for them to make, and so even when they do make it, it comes at a much higher cost, right? So much higher input costs, right? So that is one thing. The other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, China has achieved economies of scale in multiple areas of this global value chain, right? So first of all, legacy chips. In our previous podcast, we mentioned China has a comfortable dominance there and is expending a lot of money and effort to increasing that dominance as well, because it's essentially a geopolitical lever that they have against the West and its allies, to basically respond against more and more sanctions against China being able to acquire leading edge chips, right, for AI purposes and all. So what ends up happening is that if you have to compete against China in this particular, let's say, segment, right? So let's assume defense electronics as a segment of the global electronics market, right? So, and I have some figures here. For instance, the global defense electronics market itself was valued at only $163 billion last year, but the global electronics market overall was $1.3 trillion, right? So the it's like just around 10%, just over 10% or so is defense electronics overall, right? So you need to remember that this kind of things especially do not come at a high volume. So if you do want to produce the same way China has, you can do it for, let's say, consumer electronics. You can do it for legacy chips. And India is doing that right now, essentially by starting its semiconductor journey. But if it wants, so if private sector companies want to be able to make all these basic components from the get go from scratch, you just don't have the demand that can sustain it. You don't have a market demand. You don't have clients other than the government, for instance, who can buy this off you. So you can't ship high volumes. You don't have extraneous sources of, let's say, of buyers or clients. So what ends up happening is you need to be able to recoup those costs, those high costs that you incur when trying to build all of this in the country, right? So yeah, so these are realities that we need to address when we think about how to indigenize or how to reduce costs.
Interesting point you made about the private sector and their sentiments, because obviously there are uh, many national security concerns and some economic logics to kind of explain whatever policy maneuvers India has undertaken in this regard. But just today I was also reading another piece on a letter that was apparently circulated by the defense ministry to private enterprises in June, which kind of, it was a advisory or a warning type of a circular that tried to tell these firms that be cautious if you're importing components from China for what you talked about, right? Drone manufacturing. And some of these firms, Dhakshan, Manned Systems, Garuda Aerospace, so on and so forth, they were supposed to be reportedly engaged in selling or supply of drones and UAVs that had components from China, right? And of course, much of it, given that it's also a defense ministry circular, comes from stems from national security related insecurities. But I think a lot of it is also about trying to boost maybe domestic manufacturing of defense electronics, no matter the size of the domestic or global market. The protectionism has just become a trend more than an imperative, in my opinion. And so naturally, private sectors are going to face a lot of the brunt of it, both of innovating very quickly and providing for it very quickly as well, and of course then trying to produce outcomes that can eventually both be worthy of domestic consumption and export. So Satya, just to nitpick a little bit on everything that you said and maybe ask two quick follow-up questions. The procurement costs that you talked about, right? And how much of what maybe the private enterprises in India produce takes components from China, which are, obviously cheaper. And so do you think this restriction on the ability to import from China easily could have been one of the reasons why Apple felt it had to relocate its iPhone 16 supply chains back to China or to other locations? So that's one. And the second quick follow up is, you talked about legacy chips, right? And Chinese dominance. Since the discussion is on strategic electronics, do you think legacy chips today, if they can be locally sourced from a lot of locations and not just China, are really, should really be strategic? I know for a fact it is on a lot of countries' critical elements or strategic electronics lists, but do you think that should be the case?
Right. So just like before, you may have to remind me of the second question if I get carried away.
Of course.
Sorry, but anyway. So the first question, just to clarify, by the way, a lot of components are still banned from being sourced from Chinese vendors directly. What ends up happening, however, in practice, is that a lot of storefronts, a lot of vendors in, let's say, Singapore, Taiwan, other Asian countries, for instance, which are on the, let's say, the white list for now, right? For lack of a better word, and they essentially provide essentially some sort of self attestation, right? Is that, hey, this is a secure electronics, it doesn't have anything from a Chinese entity, we are the people who produce this, right? But where they source individual components, like smaller components, let's say a very small chip on a particular board that handles a very like specific task, very simple task, right? That could be made in China, for instance, right? But it's essentially impossible to be able to trace back the origin of that very specific component on that board, right? And it's also like, and that's a function of the global value chain and how it operates. The sheer number of players that operate at every single stage of the value chain is incredibly difficult to keep track of. I don't think there are any third party auditing mechanisms that are available. So, and I think the Ministry of Defense also knows this, is because of which they don't insist upon going the last mile to determine where a particular component originated, right? And that seems to be the unspoken consensus among the sector, is that, yeah, sure, you banned procurement from Chinese entities, but those end up getting used in our components anyway. It's just it's just an uncomfortable secret, and you have to live with it. So that begs the question of what exactly, whether it's the policies that we have against trade barrier, in terms of trade barriers against Chinese chips, is even effective at all, right? That's not to say that it doesn't pose a security risk. I'm just saying that maybe there are other ways in which to determine whether or not something is a security risk or not, and also enable easier procurement of critical components where India doesn't have the capacity to start off right now, and at least as a temporary measure, cannot afford to do that if we want to modernize or indigenize rapidly, right? So that's the first point.
Right. So, sorry, just a quick intervention. So, maybe then are you also telling us that the rules of origin related restrictions are kind of really hard to place, also because it's so hard to trace some of these backward linkages. So then, do any of these rules of origin kind of restrictions?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, see, to a certain extent, you can do it, which is how the US can, for instance, enforce sanctions, right, or export controls in the first place. And it also requires tremendous state capacity. By the way, the US has literally, departments in their government, federal government, dedicated to doing so, right? It's
With funding. Yeah.
Yeah, and with a lot of funding, like billions of dollars of funding. India does not. I don't think anyone's going to question that. And alongside that, a lot of diversion risks also exist, right? How do you determine whether something is counterfeit or not? How do you determine whether something has been smuggled to Taiwan and Singapore and then has been integrated into legitimate electronics or not, right? Because at the end of the day, the only thing you can rely on is those particular vendors saying, "Hey, trust me, bro." That's about it, right? So it's self-attestation most of the time. I think there are some third-party firms which do offer some sort of supply chain risk management, or basically certify that the XYZ components are specifically from this place and are secure, right? They conduct some sort of cybersecurity check. I haven't been able to find out specific details yet, but hopefully, if someone is listening, they can help us with this.
I mean, I'm guessing one of the parameters to look for would be China's electronics export numbers, right? If the numbers remain same or go up, most likely, they haven't tapped into new markets, but they've continued to retain the same markets in one way or another.
Yeah, that's for sure. And also, you remember that a lot of the satellite nations whose export numbers are also dependent on being able to import cheaply from China will not want to, just up and stop just because sanctions, etc., are imposed, right? Yeah. They need to be able to make a living, etc. So they're going to try and find ways around it regardless. So diversion risks will exist regardless, right? Either through finding legal loopholes or smuggling, etc. And anyway, to address all of these diversion risks, you need tremendous state capacity and also a consensus among other allies or other nations. India has no control over what Taiwanese or Singaporean firms do, and you are reliant upon them, for better or for worse, right now. And anyway, just saying that Atmanirbharta is a myth. You can't. What you can hope to do is, in parts of the value chain, you can aim to become dominant, so that your geopolitical power, your geoeconomic power can balance out the powers of your adversary nations who you are maybe reliant on, right? So if they want to stop the supply of something, you can also utilize your leverage in some way to counter that, right? So that is essentially what national power should be, or policy should be, right? So anyway, so the second part of the first question, which is why did Foxconn, I think, went back to China or move some of the iPhone 16, I think, lines back to China. Yes, one part of it is definitely the fact that you don't have a subcontractor ecosystem in India who can make the the small sensors, the extremely finely manufactured, designed and produced components that can go into iPhones, right? Not because we don't have the talent to be able to make those. It's not a question of talent. It's the fact that China has 3-4 decades worth of experience of and knowledge of how to build things, and process innovation is an equally important part of manufacturing that a lot of people like forget about, right?
Of
It's
course.
not just R&D into design or materials, etc. Is to be able to know how to make things, learning by doing, essentially, right? And that's what China has done so well, has honed over 4 decades. So first of all, that is the problem. Second, you have a pretty ad hoc tariff policy. This year, a lot of the tariffs on components on some minerals have been lowered and streamlined, but it's still far from good, right? Effectively, a lot of these components should come in at zero tariffs. So you have trade barriers on that front as well, which makes it more expensive for Indian private sector defense electronics firms to be able to import competitively, and then also design and make products which can compete on cost. Let's say, because the end goal should be able to cater to export markets. That's how you become competitive in a value chain. So if India's defense electronics makers want to become more competitive in this, they need to be able to import competitively as well. So I still don't know why tariffs are so ad hoc and not streamlined well enough. I think the government wants to do that, at least in the speech that they mentioned in the budget session, I think. Hopefully that comes to order. And the third part is, I think the talent, the quality of labor is one thing, but again, that's a chicken and egg problem as of now, and that can only happen. I mean, I think that can only happen when more and more assembly plants, for instance, get set up in India. And I think on that front, we are doing better, and we can do better, even better, by focusing on some of the infrastructure related stuff, some labor law streamlining, some compliance streamlining as well. But yeah, so all of these as a whole, and a lot of other factors, primarily the reasons why Foxconn shifted some of its production lines back to China. It's just cheaper overall. They can only absorb some of the costs associated with producing in India for so long. So second question was, are legacy chips really strategic?
Yeah.
Good question. As I mentioned at the start of the podcast, literally anything can be strategic depending on the kind of consequences that you think are going to arise if you don't have access to them, right? So now a lot of people think legacy chips which have been, to borrow from the parlance of the US Chips Act, anything that has been produced over, let's say, 28 nanometer process node is a legacy chip. These are not chips that necessarily perform at the highest performance thresholds. These are not chips that go into smartphones. Well, they're not the main chips that go into smartphones and laptops. Those are usually made on the latest 4, 5, 7 nanometer nodes, right? But where these chips actually go into, things like your monitor, things like your car, things like your even in a smartphone and laptops, but doing other functions other than processing, in your mics, on the phone or the Bluetooth headset that you are listening to this podcast on, right? So all of this, and not to mention critical infra like power grids, like straight up even in server racks and data centers, and almost anything, right, in telecom. So I would say, yeah, in a nutshell, they are strategic, because the moment you lose supply of these, or you lose the ability to be able to procure them from any particular platform, or if they're compromised through, let's say, hardware backdoors in some way, you will lose access to the underlying. Basically, you lose access to the way of life we have right now.
Yeah.
Right? That's why the US and its allies are so concerned.
Yeah. So Satya, I'm really convinced with the point you're making about legacy chips being strategic electronics, and it does not necessarily have to be the case that they're strategic electronics because they're obviously not at the cutting edge of technological production, right? So that's obviously not the reason here. But I am convinced with the point you're making about how basically in most electronics goods and even in critical information infrastructure that our country has deployed, and like you said, any kind of restrictions from our key import partners manipulating the supply of legacy chips to India would obviously damage our own economic growth and of course investment in a lot of things that, as you said, contribute to our way of life as we know it. Such interesting stuff. And of course the moving back of maybe some of the iPhone 16 production lines, and from the rest of the arguments that you made, it seems clear that even though China too has to import a lot of high end components like processors or memory chips. And that's obviously where some of the sanctions from the countries in the geopolitical West are trying to act. Uh, Despite all of that import, the total production cost still continues to be lower. So I think one of the priorities of the Indian policy apparatus, if it really has to compete on cost advantage once it's overcome the talent problem, the acquisition problem, and of course the learning by doing problem, it really has to take into account the fact that it has to really lower production costs. So Satya, I'm going to come to you with my last question, which is about these cost preferences and what approach the Indian government should take going forward for this, right? Of course, some positive news in addition to the budget speech you talked about also comes from the economic survey that just came out recently, which maybe slightly shifted the Overton window, or maybe broadened the Overton window towards India taking a nuanced stance, right? Not outrightly restricting imports or attaching a PLI to products, but also kind of saying that for India to become an export hub and not really an import substitutor, it needs to be linked with Chinese global value chains. So some positive signals there. But aside from that, could you maybe give our listeners some final policy kind of suggestions on how to incentivize domestic production and what the government should be prepared for to beat maybe the cost advantages in strategic electronics that China possesses?
Right. Okay. So, in a nutshell, if I have to encapsulate, my thoughts on this, is that when you're starting off with a goal of indigenization of strategic electronics, which is a worthy goal, by the way, like there are significant national security risks as well as just resiliency. For reasons of resiliency, would want to indigenize or at least develop capability to produce most of these electronics in our country, in our home territory, right? So, but essentially, this policy goal should not also come simultaneously alongside a policy goal of cost reductions in terms of procuring these electronics, right? So, as you mentioned, the economics of the global value chains simply don't support it, right? If you want to start from scratch, or even like at the lower end of the supply chain, and you want to be able to make better and better products as time goes on, you need to be able to, first of all, support this sector, the private sector, or even defense pieces for that matter, as of now, in a way that allows them to uh, circumvent the fact that the volume of products that they make here are very limited, very low, right? The only buyers are the government and the armed forces, and the volume of products are I would say like hundreds of thousands or less than that, much less than that, right? Compared to consumer electronics, which is like hundreds of millions in the world. So you can't achieve economies of scale quickly. You need to be able to expend a lot of capital and cash essentially to build the infrastructure, to be able to focus on R&D, to be able to focus on process improvements. So if you want that to be the focus, you cannot aim for cost reduction simultaneously, right? So you need to provide targeted support to this sector. You can fund them, you can provide guaranteed procurement guarantees, for instance. Obviously, incentives for R&D. All of these are very broad policy measures, right? So, but um, the issue is, most of the time what ends up happening is heavy protectionism becomes the de facto government policy towards doing something like this, right?
Yeah.
And that is, again, as you mentioned, in order to export competitively, you need to be able to import competitively. So components, etc., where we do not have a starting capacity in, we need to get those from abroad for now. Over time, as the linkages increase, as we become more and more dominant in the value chain, even foreign firms will come and set up their facilities in India, right? And that is the whole idea of what it means to integrate into the value chain, right? So, which is why protectionism is not the way to go. Electronic trade barriers is not the way to go. You need the industry to mature and achieve economies of scale, especially as the divide between consumer electronics and defense electronics becomes thinner, right, and more muddled. You can achieve economies of scale simply by having firms or foundries make chips that go in for consumer devices, but also which can be used for making strategic electronics, right? Chips, right? So yeah, so essentially that is the broad level policy insight I would say I take away from this.
Yeah, and Satya, just maybe one quick follow up, because we've had discussions on this at Takshashila in the past, which is, we've talked a lot about there being certain international standards, maybe such as the NATO guidelines on airworthiness for drone manufacturing, right? Which kind of need to be taken into account when you are kind of setting out on this path to indigenize production for a lot of the defense electronics. Are these standards something that perhaps India is doing well with, or are there ways to either circumvent or really incorporate them in legislation or regulation surrounding the production of strategic electronics?
Right. So I don't know if regulation and or legislation exists in harmonizing domestic strategic electronics production with standards and NATO standards, right? However, there was a panel at the Strategic Electronics Summit. There was a panel on, and it was primarily business focused panel, right? And the idea was for to understand how to harmonize with NATO standards better, and it's a good thing because first of all, that means when you put your product out in the export market globally, it will already be compatible with, say, a lot of logistics and procurement mechanisms, or essential quality thresholds or reliability thresholds, interoperability thresholds that other countries in the world have, because they're already using NATO standardized equipment, right? So that is a great way to the moment you standardize, you have um, reduced one entry barrier into the global market for strategic electronics, and that is not a very small thing. As I mentioned, it was $163 billion in 2023. So and while I think India's share of that was $5 billion, so a $5 billion domestic market in India is not going to be able to sustain the private sector for very long. And also, I don't think that $5 billion is being met by the private sector entirely. I think quite a huge chunk of it is met by defense PSUs, right? So private sector needs to be able to, in order to achieve, like I said, economies of scale, and to be able to become competitive globally and meet that kind of quality, you need to be able to export and meet clients, demands, not demands, what do you say, requirements on a fairly regular cadence, right? So yeah, so in order to be able to do that, you need to be able to plug into countries again. So your clients are only going to be government and armed forces. So their equipment, if it's NATO standardized, the moment you make your products compatible with that, you're in, right? So at the very least, you have a level playing field at that point. So yeah, standardization is extremely important.
Yeah, I mean, excellent points. And from what I understand, based on whatever I've read, right, even in the contest for trying to become the right alternative in many countries, China plus one strategy, right? India has seen many competitors, and Vietnam and Mexico basically are names that come up at the top most of the time. And one of the things that really has worked for Vietnam, aside from the fact that on the regulatory restrictiveness or the openness to business indices, Vietnam has done much better than India has. One of the other things is that it's really done well to incorporate into its regulatory apparatus the mechanism of, like you said, bringing cadence between international standards and the standards of production at home. So yeah, I think that's definitely an important takeaway, should be an important takeaway for the Indian indigenization trajectory going forward. Thank you so much, Satya, for your insights. I think this has been a really fascinating discussion. I think I especially liked one of the phrases that you used throughout this episode, which was economic realities. And I think it's absolutely pertinent from what I've taken away, that India approach the so-called economic realities with a very nuanced and clear-eyed understanding, and prioritize indigenization where absolutely necessary. Of course, not all national security concerns are peculiar, but at the same time also apply economic logic, as, like I said, the economic survey is hinting towards when it comes to the production of both consumer and defense electronics. So thanks again, Satya, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.